Let's go from perek Hey Mishnah Tes, the fifth perek, ninth Mishnah. So, the Mishnah begins. We were discussing previously, and we're going to continue for most of the perek, the idea that you want to make sure the two things you're using, what you're taking meiser, if you're taking meiser from produce from one place, and meiser from produce from another place, you want to be sure that they're the same status. That they both for sure do have an obligation, or if they're demai, if they're an uncertain obligation, then you're gonna want to isolate them and only take off from that specific
chapter
produce.
5, Mishnah
9.
I don't see Mishnah.
Are you in demai?
Oh, I'm not. I'm in Baya. That doesn't help.
Okay, so previously we were discussing essentially if you buy from a source, whether you assume all the produce they're selling actually come from the same source. Now in a new idea, Meiser Mishal Yisrael al Shal Nachar. So now we're talking about you buy stuff that you're told for sure Meiser wasn't taken. So this Mishnah holds that the obligation that a non-Jew purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael does not remove the Meiser obligation from what grows on that land. So if you buy, let's say, grain from a non-Jew who has a field in Eretz Yisrael, you could take meiser from stuff that grew in a Jew's field on that produce of the non-Jew, and mishal nachri al shel Yisrael, or vice versa. You could use the non-Jew's produce to take meiser on the Jew's produce because they're both in equal status. They both have a full obligation. And similarly, mishal Yisrael al shel Kusim, mishal Kusim al shel Yisrael. The first Tanna says, right, Kusim are no different than either Jews or non-Jews. They have a regular obligation to take meiser. There's no reason to assume that they took off meiser, and therefore they're interchangeable. Rabbi Eliezer, Eiser, Mishal Kusim, Al Shal Kusim. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you can't be sure that all the Kusim are the same, because some
I'm sorry, what chapter again?
5, Mishnah 9. You can't be certain all the Kusim are the same, because some Kusim are better than others. So maybe one Kusi did take off meiser like he's supposed to, and one didn't. Therefore, Kusim are going to remain in this safek meiser category. It's uncertain whether meiser was taken or not, and therefore they're not interchangeable. Okay. Mishnah Yud. Now, the 10th Mishnah. Atzutz nakov. If you have something that grows in a flower pot that has a hole, in a pot with a hole. So it grew in a flower pot, but the flower pot had drainage holes in the bottom. Then harezek arts. That pot does not really do anything, because since there's a hole in the bottom, what grows in it is able to get nutrients from the soil underneath it. And so it's like it grew in the ground. And therefore, so therefore, if Tara me'aretz al atziznak, if you took Truma from something that grew in the ground, on something that grew in a flower pot that had a hole in the bottom, or me'atzitznakav al haaretz, or from something that grew in this pot, on something that grew in the ground, Truma said Truma, because really they're really the same thing. However, Mishaenu Nakov, if it doesn't have a hole in the bottom, if it's a closed pot, ala Nakov, so that really didn't grow from the ground, that really does not have any obligation in Truma, but Midrabanan, they said you should take off Truma because people will get confused, flower pots are... Some are and some aren't. So they said take Truma from everything, but if you take Mishainu Nakov, if you take from a pot that has no hole, Al Nakov, on something else that grew in a different pot that did have a hole, then Truma v'yachzer v'yitrin. So the first Truma really wasn't Truma. It really didn't work, because there was no obligation to take Truma from this thing that grew in not from the ground, because it was cut off from the ground by its pot. So you have to take Truma again, but since the
Does this
Rabbanan...
mean there are two pots and one's perforated and one's not?
Right, one has a hole, so it's connected to the ground. One has no hole, so it's not connected to the ground.
Yeah, so, okay.
However, if you go the other way, if you take from the flower pot that has a hole, Truma, for the one that didn't have a hole, then it's a real problem. Because then what you're taking really isn't Truma, because the one without you're taking from something that has a real obligation of Truma and using it for something that does not have a real obligation. So then Truma, so the Kohen can keep it, but what the Kohen is getting is really not Truma. It's really something that someone made a mistake and thought was Truma. So the Kohen keeps it, but the Kohen has produce that was not really fixed, because it wasn't really Truma, nothing was actually taken off of this, so the Kohen is going to have to take Truma and Meisers off of that which you gave him as Truma, and only then will he be allowed to eat it. Okay, and Mishnah Yud Aleph, the final Mishnah of the perek, Torah min hadumai al dumai. If you did take Truma from one batch of Demai on another, even though we said you shouldn't, midumai alavada, you took Truma from Demai on something that for sure needed Truma. So again, it's Truma, the Kohen can keep then. V'yachzer v'yitruma, and you have to take again Truma from either the Demai, or the thing that for sure needed Truma. And again, the other problem, minavada al, if you took off Truma something that Truma for sure had not been separated on Demai, then again, Truma, the Kohen can keep it, but if the Demai already had Truma separated, what you gave him really wasn't Truma, and therefore, he can't eat that Truma until he separates Trumas and Meisers from somewhere else. Okay, hopefully we'll start the 6th perek tomorrow.